Welcome to On the Fringe. I'm your host, Angela Thomas. Our guest today is Dr. Paul Smith, a retired U.S. Army major who was the foremost expert in remote viewing. He is the author of The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing and Reading the Enemy's Mind Inside Stargate, America's Psychic Espionage Program. Dr. Smith is a former president of the International Remote Viewing Association, and he currently sits on the board of the IRVA. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Paul, exactly what is remote viewing?
Well, I will be as exact as it's possible for a discipline like this.
Right.
So, remote viewing essentially is a skill that takes advantage of an underlying human faculty that everyone seems to be blessed with. And it helps us to perceive, experience information and such things, sensory perceptions and such, at from targets that are either far away from us in distance or behind shielding or distant in time. It's essentially a form of applied extrasensory perception. I sometimes describe it as being controlled clairvoyance, if you will, that is used in for practical purposes.
I see. So do you need to use psychic abilities in order to remote view?
In very broad terms, it is a psychic ability, essentially. Well, it's a skill that uses your psychic abilities, I guess is probably more precise. Everybody seems to have the ability to be psychic, and of course, I really don't like that term very well because it's so imprecise,
Right.
And there's of course a lot of cultural baggage that comes along with it. But for want of a better term, everybody has this underlying ability to be psychic. They just have to kind of learn how to apply it, how to make it work, and learn when you're being psychic and when it's just mental noise and all that. And remote viewing is designed to help you actualize that ability and apply it in a disciplined way.
I see. So, Paul, you know, your program Stargate, the Psychic Espionage Program, were you essentially a psychic spy?
That's pretty much what it boils down to. And it's interesting when you tell people that they first don't believe it, and then they're not sure what they think of it, and then it goes from there.
Right. So part of that Stargate program, what type of projects or targets did you work on?
We essentially did a cross-section of any intelligence problem that the U.S. military and U.S. intelligence establishment might have. So we did things from trying to find hostages in the Middle East to describing the sequence of events in Soviet and Chinese nuclear tests, to trying to ferret out information about new Soviet weapons systems, to trying to track down narco-traffickers and contraband. The sky's the limit. We did anything and everything, at least some elements of anything or anything that the intelligence community might need to have done in the course of pursuing its mission.
Well, certainly that is a large mission. Paul, let me ask you, how successful was the program?
Well, considering that critics and skeptics might say it shouldn't have succeeded at all, the fact that we had any success at all is a miracle in and of itself. But we had a lot of success. It's not something you can measure in terms of what percentage of our information was correct, because oftentimes we produce information that couldn't even be checked because of the circumstances on the ground. But generally speaking, if you take a broad survey of the evaluations we got from our customers, we were successful in that we provided useful information that proved to be correct. Roughly 30% of the time high quality, and up to 50% of the time some value. So, 50-50, that sounds like, you're just flipping a coin. But when you consider that this is actually a practical application and that most intelligence disciplines don't do any better than that, we were doing at least as well and often better than most of the other intelligence disciplines that use more more typical, normal techniques, if you will.
I see. So let me ask you, Paul, on measuring the success of the program, being a remote viewer, was there any way of maybe measuring time or using time? You talked about tracking individuals, for the government. Were you able to go into the future? Were you working strictly in the present, or did that incorporate the past?
The interesting thing about remote viewing is that it isn't restricted by time the way normal perceptual techniques are. You can remote view events in the past to which we had, and when I say we, the government, but it could be anybody, right, had no access. For example, we were sometimes tasked to report on essentially the intentions and discussions in a closed meeting, for example, of the Politburo. Right. Nobody was there on our side, so we had to use ESP to try and get in it. Those things were a little hard to verify. But I'll give you an example of a practical test we did.
Okay.
And they decided to pick an event that was clear that we had all the data on so they could evaluate how well we did. Now, one thing you have to know about remote viewing is that the viewer has to be completely blind to the target. That means the viewer cannot know what he or she is remote viewing. It cannot know anything about it when they go into the session. If they learn anything about it, it has to be through this extrasensory means. So viewers go in, all they get is a number. The number doesn't have any cognitive content. It might be something like, and I always like to use this one, 8675309, for example. That might be the targeting number, right?
Right.
And the viewer gets that number and then proceeds to remote view whatever the intent is that number is linked to. And it's all a subconscious thing. The subconscious goes out of the universe to find out what that number has to do with. So they picked Pearl Harbor, the Pearl Harbor attack. And, of course, none of us knew that was the target. We had no idea it was the target, but it was certainly, at the time, this was the mid-'80s, so it was almost 50 years in the past. And we were targeted on it, and, in fact, we quite successfully described it. In fact, some of the viewers said, wow, this really reminds me of Pearl Harbor. That actually came out. So that shows you the past is not a problem. Present, obviously, you'd expect that to be something we could manage. The future also can be done. Now, the future isn't as predictable as a lot of folks want to think it is. If it were, that would mean the future is fixed, which means, well, all kinds of implications concerning free will and everything. We don't need to go into that right now. But you can review the future to some extent, recognizing that the future isn't fixed, and so you may be picking up on a possible future that ultimately doesn't happen. But we did succeed on some occasions in actually describing a future event that did indeed happen. And I'm not talking about some little thing like the stock market's going up or down. I'm talking about something big. Like, for example, I, completely blind to start with, ultimately described an attack on an American warship that no one had anticipated, and I did it 50 hours in advance of when it actually happened.
Wow, 50 hours in advance.
That's documented, the 50 hours. It's absolutely documented. So it is possible to do, and you can't do that with a satellite.
Right. Well, that's an extraordinary feat there, Paul. You know, I was reading your book, Reading the Enemy's Mind, and by the way, fabulous book. You are an expert in the Middle Eastern studies and part of the intelligent community. Can you tell us how you got started in remote viewing?
Yes. It had nothing to do with any choice I made to start with. I mean, I had never heard of remote viewing. I was a bit of a mild skeptic when it came to extrasensory perception. I'd been involved in a junior high science project, which had totally failed, and so I decided there wasn't any truth to ESP. And unbeknownst to me, some of my neighbors who were in the remote viewing program were looking for new recruits, and they were observing me. I didn't know I was being observed, right? It shows you how psychic I was at the time. I didn't know I was being observed. And one day they came over and said, you know, we think you might be good in our program. And I said, what do you do? And they said, we can't tell you. I said, how am I going to know if I'm good? How can I know if I'm going to be any good or not? I said, well, we're going to give you some tests, and then if you score properly, we'll read you on and give you the opportunity to volunteer if you want. So I took the tests, and they were happy with those, and I ended up going over, and one of my neighbors, Tom McNair, sat me down, and he said, okay, he gave me this thing to sign saying I'd give away my firstborn if I ever revealed any secrets, right? Anyway, he said, what we do is we collect intelligence against foreign threats using a parapsychological discipline called remote viewing. We essentially want you to volunteer to become a psychic spy. And, of course, that was a broadside, right? What?
Exactly.
But the fact is that as he's talking, I'm doing this calculation. I used to be interested in ESP. I believed it didn't work. He's telling me they're actually recruiting people and training them to use ESP as spies. There is clearly a line budget item here. Budget line item, I got to say that right. Budget line item that Congress has approved that pays for this program. That must mean it really does work. There's no way in heck I'm not going to do this.
Right, I would have jumped in it as well.
Absolutely. I think he was surprised at how quickly I said yes, because it was a great opportunity as far as I was concerned. So
let me ask you, Paul, speaking of all of this program, there was a movie called The Men Who Stare at Goats. Was that an accurate depiction?
It was very funny and completely warped. Now, it was not accurate at all. It's one of those things like the movie that says, this movie was based on real events, and right. You know that it's nothing like those real events, right? And that was the case with this movie. I actually got a kick out of it. I enjoyed it quite a bit. But fortunately, they didn't pretend that it was all that accurate, because it wasn't. There was lots of stuff in there that wasn't true at all, and there was definite distortions of what had actually happened and misrepresentations. But it was all, I think, done for comedic effect, and then it succeeded in that. So.
Well, at least it gave the public the opportunity to know that there actually was a psychic program within the United States government. So, Paul, I understand that you were asked to write the official program of remote viewing. How did that come about?
Well, that was actually the manual for what we now call controlled remote viewing. Mm-hmm. We were being trained by Ingo Swann, who is the creator of remote viewing and the primary, I guess you could say, the primary remote viewer at SRI International, which was the government think tank that had been contracted to work on this in this field. So Ingo was training us. That included 5 of us all together, and the people who were in charge of our organization felt like I seemed to have gotten the idea of it better than anybody else in terms of capturing the notes, capturing the concepts. The one exception is Tom McNair, who was the prototype, and he was engaged elsewhere, so I got to use some of his material. They just thought, and I had writing skills that in fact, of course, my last name is Smith, and our boss, Colonel Brian Busby, called me Wordsmith, humorously, he thought. So I had these writing skills and had gotten the concepts down really well, so they figured I was the one that'd do it. Now I generally say, if I have more time to explain, I'm the primary author. I had help from everybody, and I don't want to shortchange their contributions to it. I had access to their notes. I was able to consult with them, and some of them contributed some of the written material. So I was both an author and an editor of that document. So,
well, that's some document too. Paul, in your book, The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing, you introduce the reader to the basic fundamentals of remote viewing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that's like saying, you're really hungry, so here's a steak. Can you eat just a little bit of it, right? Well, first of all, I guess, and I'm not even sure where to start, but let's say it's largely subconsciously based, as a lot of extrasensory perception is. Mm-hmm. A lot of the guiding mechanism and intentionality in it seems to be based in the subconscious, or as some people like to call it, the unconscious. The goal of the whole remote viewing process, there's 2 goals to it. The first one is to be able to bring this subconscious, unconscious information up through the liminal threshold into conscious awareness so you can actually do something with it. If it stays in the subconscious, it's useless. If it gets into the conscious awareness, you can actually record it, report it, and take some action based on it that way. And so the first goal is to get this subconscious information into conscious awareness. The second thing is a problem with that process itself. The problem with the process is that when things become conscious, then our left brain gets involved in the process, and the left brain is an interpreter. It takes data and it tells you what it means. But with remote viewing, oftentimes it starts off with a very narrow bandwidth. You get a little bit of information at a time, and the left brain will often jump to conclusions. We call this mental noise. It's giving you guesses and inferences and things that are probably incorrect. So what the goal of particularly the controlled remote viewing process that I teach formally, the goal of that is, first of all, help you become consciously aware of the data, the experiences, and the information. And secondly, to be able to deal with this mental noise that gets added to it as you go. Mm-hmm. And really, I mean, there's a lot to the process of learning it, but those are the two main features, the two main things that are important here. And I want to say the mental noise thing is crucial. It was really pretty much, I won't say it was discovered by Ingo Swann, but it was formalized and recognized by Ingo Swann based on his research that he'd done in the past. René Walt-Collier, who was an early parapsychologist, had some hints about it, but didn't really get all the way to the cognizance of it. Also, Upton Sinclair, who wrote the book Mental Radio about some experiments he did with his wife on this stuff, he recognized a bit of this mental noise thing without drawing the right conclusions from it. Ingo took all of that and his own experiences, and he put together this idea that he understood mental noise and came up with a mechanism to deal with it, which is a crucial part of remote viewing. Now, I'm saying all this stuff because it leads to an interesting point about natural psychics versus remote viewers. Generally speaking, there are some really good natural psychics. There's a bunch of them that aren't very good. And it isn't that they're not very good, some of them aren't very good for a reason that they don't realize. They are getting a signal, but they don't understand mental noise. And so oftentimes what they express, what they think are psychic impressions, actually are these workings of the left brain, this mental noise. And the really good psychics are the ones who've kind of figured that out through trial and error, and they themselves might not even be able to express that that's what they've come to a realization about, but they have learned how to deal with mental noise and get cut through the signal, and that's why they're good. If a lot of other people understood the mental noise thing in the general psychic realm, I think we'd see a lot more success there.
Understandable. So, beyond the essential guide to remote viewing, I understand that you teach a live controlled remote viewing program. Is that correct?
Yes, I do.
So will you share with us what that all entails?
A lot of work. Yes. Really, obviously, the best way to learn remote viewing is to learn it live from a real teacher like I did, from a good teacher like I did from Ingo Swann. Mm-hmm. But that obviously is very demanding. My courses are, I generally they've been characterized as the Cadillac or the Rolls Royce of the remote viewing training field. There are a lot of other folks out there who have a lot of competition, and they have good courses, but I have really kind of engineered this to be the most top-notch course you could take if you really want to learn remote viewing. And hence, it's got a huge amount of time investment. So each of my course levels, or 3 of them, are 5 and a fraction days. Literally, you come to my class, you spend 8 to 10 hours a day in the class, and then you have homework. It's
Wow.
the equivalent of a full semester of a college class. And you do that in 1 week. So you can tell it's very intense. Of course, that's valuable because you really, really, really learn it. And it almost guarantees you're going to have at least some success with it. Right?
So you're really totally engrossed in the process.
Absolutely, and it's I'm probably scaring some people off, but it is doable. I haven't killed anybody in my course, so it is doable. You just have to be committed to wanting to learn remote viewing.
Right. Now, I understand that you have an alternative to the live control remote viewing program. I believe it's called Remote Perception. Is that correct?
Yes. Over the years, I've gotten a lot of letters and emails and phone calls from folks who really want to take my class, but they just don't have the resources for it.
Certainly.
And so they say, well, is there anything else? Is there a home study class I can take? Is there a book I can read? And there hasn't been any that I've been happy with. And there aren't that many anyway, but the ones that are out there I wasn't really pleased with. And finally, a production company who I felt like could actually pull it off, technologically speaking, we got together and we produced a home study course 4-DVD set that gives the essence of my week-long CRV course. And it's a fraction of the cost of the CRV course. You can do it in your own living room. Obviously, there's a lot left out. There's no way you can get 5.5 days of coursework into 4 DVDs.
Sure.
But I've distilled it down so that this will really give somebody a really great step forward in learning how to do this process.
Well, how do we obtain a copy of this? How do our listeners find Remote Perception?
Actually, you can go to remoteperception.com. Now, I should say remote perception doesn't sound like remote viewing, right?
Right.
Well, it's because remote viewing probably should have been called remote perception in the first place, because remote viewing actually involves all 5 and plus of the sense modalities. Now, it is extrasensory perception, but the perceptual centers of the brain do seem to be involved. The signal seems to skip over the senses and come into and be processed by the perception centers in the brain. And so you do have like visual and tactile and smell experiences and these kind of things, right? So it really, really should have been remote perception and not remote viewing. I have taken the liberty of calling this what is essentially my remote viewing course. I'm calling it a remote perception to try and honor that truth about the process. So if you go to remoteperception.com, you can order a copy. And right now it's actually on discount, as I recall. I think that's about 20% off, something like that. So it would be a good time.
And how do we get your book, The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing?
So that one is only available through its website. So let me repeat the remoteperception.com website so you don't forget that, remoteperception.com. The website for the remote viewing book is, and of course it's called The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing. So if you type in guide-to-remoteviewing.com.
Guide-to-remoteviewing.com, all right?
Yes, the words all spelled out, guide-to-remoteviewing.com, yep. And that will take you to it.
And your personal website, Paul, is rviewer.com?
It is. The letter R and the word viewer, so rviewer.com.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, for joining us today. And be sure to visit Paul's website, rviewer.com. You've been listening to On the Fringe with Angela Thomas. Good day.